Hi everyone, this is Adam at the Astro Imaging channel. Tonight's presentation is going to be by Josh Smith, and it's on narrowband imaging from acquisition through processing. So right now I'm going to pass it right over to Josh, and he will take it away. There you go, Josh.
Thanks, Adam. Interrupt if there's any audio. So tonight I'm going to go through narrowband imaging, and I'm going to cover quite a bit in a short amount of time, and then I will spend some time from there forward, maybe going into more detail in the processing side of things and answering any questions. But so the topics I want to include tonight are going to have to do with filter selection, then selecting your targets. Talk a little bit about sub-exposure and integration length, collecting RGB stars for the color, and then some in tone mapping, color mapping, then combining all of that data, whether it's one-shot color, RGB, or just narrowband. And then finally I'll go over the final presentation styles that you can do. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about filter selection, and there's a lot of other kinds of filters other than the three that I'm showing on the screen right now, but the main three that you think of when you're doing narrowband imaging are O3, HA, and S2. They're like the Hubble palette uses those filters, and a lot of the emission nebula typically emit around those emission lines. So O3, or oxygen, is kind of a blue-green teal color, around 501 nanometers in the visible spectrum. Hydrogen alpha is kind of like a deep red, and it's just outside of the visible spectrum and is around 656 nanometers. And then finally sulfur is around 672 nanometers, which is also just outside of the visible spectrum. So talking about filter selection, there's some things that you want to think about. Some of the main things that you want to think about mostly are the bandpass size. They can range from pretty wide, even wider than the 12 nanometer I have listed here, and all the way down to 3 nanometers, depending on which manufacturer you go with and what kind of filters you go with. One that I don't have mentioned are UHC filters, which sometimes will actually have wider band passes around some of these emission lines, and actually cover a couple of the emission lines at the same time instead of just one of the emission lines. So typically a lower size band pass will increase your contrast because it's actually blocking out a lot of the sky glow. It's going to block out a lot of light pollution and even light from the moon. So what it does is it actually just lets through the signal from the target that you're shooting and not much else, especially as you get to smaller and smaller bandpass. One thing that we debate a lot are how long you want to actually expose your images for, and how long of integration time you want. When you go to these narrower bandpass like the Astrodon 3 nanometer, sometimes they take ridiculously long amounts of time to actually become sky limited. And when we talk about sky limited, that means the photons from the sky are overwhelming the read noise on your camera. And that's ideally where you want to be. If you can expose that long, then you're going to get the best signal to noise ratio that you can possibly get. However, as we've talked about here before, sometimes you have to be shooting 60 to 70 to 80, maybe even 90-minute subs if you're shooting at f10 to become sky limited. And then it becomes, a question if you're actually able to shoot subs that long, if it makes sense to, or if it makes more sense to mitigate the risk and shoot shorter subs and take as much signal as you can. So going on to the actual brands of filters that you can select from, there's more than what I have listed here, and I'll talk about the ones I have listed, and the ones that I've actually used, I'll give my opinions on those, but there's actually more to choose from as well. Astronomic makes some good clip filters for DSLRs. Back when I was using a Canon as my only imaging camera, and both when I had a regular astro-modified Canon and when I had a monochrome Canon, I was using astronomic clip filters for a while. Those ones are nice, and they give you an option of 12 nanometers or 6 nanometers. They worked well, and they were a good option for using with the Canon because you could actually fit them right into the Canon body with the clip filters and not increase the back focus necessary. They're, I mean, they're good filters. I would not recommend using them if you're not using a DSLR. And obviously, if you want more contrast, I'd recommend going up to the 6 nanometer versions. And I believe just earlier this year, they actually released clip filters for the full frame cameras as well. So those are now available for you. During my time with my monochrome DSLR, I actually made the switch over from astronomic filters to Beta filters. And I had the HJ and O3 and S2 filters. Those ones have band passes at 8 and 7.5 nanometers. They were, for me, they were nice introductory filters. Well, they worked well. They let me actually expose longer and start gaining some signal. They worked especially well in hydrogen alpha. The 7 nanometer hydrogen alpha filter was kind of my first real successful set of images, and the O3 filters helped somewhat, but a lot of times if the moon was up at all, or if the night wasn't very clear, the seeing wasn't very good, it just felt like I struggled a lot to get really good signal noise with the O3 filter. I not used the Orion filters. However, I've heard from some people that they're pretty good, but I haven't seen any really direct images with their narrowband filters, so I won't comment one way or another on those. Custom Scientific, before I go to Astrodon, offers pretty low bandpass filters as well. However, I've never tried those either, but I think that they actually sell them in 4.5 nanometer bandpass, and I've actually heard pretty good things about those. And finally, I'll go on to Astrodon filters, which is where I'm living right now. The Astrodons are now offered in 5 nanometer and 3 nanometer varieties. They used to be, I think it was just 6 nanometers. But I think that a lot of people kind of go the route of getting a 5 nanometer HA filter and then combine that with 3 nanometer O3 and then either a 3 or 5 nanometer S2 filter. Leading into kind of the next topic, I'll talk about why that's kind of an important thing to think about. I debated for a really long time whether or not I wanted to get a 5 or 3 nanometer O3 filter, and I went back and forth, and I wondered if it was really worth, the extra. I think it was $170 to get the 3 nanometer version, and the general argument is you're going to get more contrast with the 3 nanometer. It'll block out more light pollution. It'll let you image when the moon is a little bit fuller, and again, it will force you to actually expose for a little longer to get to sky limit exposures. And the final factor that helped me decide that I wanted to go with the 3 nanometer was looking at some of the really faint O3 targets, and some people who had experience with both really highly recommended the 3 nanometer version, and particularly, I remember, I think it was Nicholas Wooters was just in the middle of discovering OU4, or the Squid Nebula, and he started discovering it actually by finding it in his 5 nanometer O3 filter, and it was extremely faint, but he could see it there, and then so in the middle of his discovery, he switched over to the 3 nanometer version. And he has a nice little comparison on his site that shows the difference between the two filters. And to me, that was the selling point. I don't want my equipment to limit me, and if I'm going to spend that much on a filter, I think I'll spend a little bit more on a filter to get one that's never going to limit me. And so I ended up going with the 3 nanometer version of that. The reason that I stayed with the 5 nanometer for hydrogen alpha is that typically most of the hydrogen alpha targets that I'm shooting have a lot stronger signal and a lot stronger emission, and it's really just not necessary to go down to the 3 nanometers, at least where I live. I live in a red zone, not a white zone, but a red zone, and my signal gets pretty strong within 30 minutes, and if I go to 45-minute exposures, I'm getting very clean images. And and the other thing that works well by combining the 3 nanometer O3 and the HA is that the stars seem like they're a little closer in size. From some examples I've seen from other people, when you use 5 nanometers of both, sometimes your O3 stars actually end up getting a little bit larger than your HA stars. And for some people it doesn't matter because they're not going to use their narrowband stars. And they might just replace them with RGB, or maybe they just don't care about the star colors and they'll turn them all white. But in case you are using them, that's another kind of factor to think about, is actually your star size. So kind of moving on from that tangent, I'll talk about your target selection when shooting narrowband targets. When you go to actually pick a target, you should find out, which bands are actually emitting in that target, how strong the emissions are, and what the details look like. So, some of us shoot, like in the background I have the Pelican Nebula, or, the North American Nebula, which is right next door, very strong in hydrogen alpha. In fact, so strong that they show up pretty easily in one-shot color images. And you'll start seeing great signal right away with hydrogen alpha, and you'll you'll be able to tell what's going on there. There's lots of nice details in there, so it's a hydrogen alpha heavy target. But if you're planning to capture O3 with that target, then there's not really a lot there, and you have to take really long sub-exposures to actually get much data out of it, and then there's not a lot of details. So it's kind of good, to do a little research on Astrodon or Flickr or Cloudy Nights or wherever you kind of do your image sharing or image viewing, and find out what other people are taking for those targets and understand what you're actually trying to get out of the targets. When I was shooting M27, the Dumbbell Nebula, I knew there was some really faint O3 on the kind of ears of the Dumbbell Nebula that I really wanted to make sure I got. And I saw a lot of people taking 20-minute exposures, and some even taking 30-minute exposures, and they were getting some of those ears that I really wanted to see in my picture, but not a lot of them. So, I used that information to let me know, well, I want to take longer exposures and more of them to get this data that I'm looking for. So I went to, I think it was 45-minute exposures, or maybe it was 60-minute exposures, to get all of the data that I wanted to from the ears of M20. And there was a lot of really sharp detail in the hydrogen alpha line. So, all that detail in the hydrogen alpha kind of is in the inside of the Dumbbell Nebula. So to me, it was important to make sure the seeing was really good the night that I was taking the hydrogen alpha for the Dumbbell Nebula, because I wanted to get a lot of the crispness down into the core of that planetary nebula. So, I was able to shoot the O3 on a night where the seeing wasn't quite as good, but go a lot deeper, and then shoot the HA on a night when the seeing was really good and get a lot of crisp detail. So that kind of thought process, I think, is important when you're shooting these kind of targets. And I can go on to another target and think about like the Veil Nebulas, which has great detail, and actually all three channels, hydrogen alpha, O3, and S2. So that's kind of a target where if you're jumping around and you have plenty of clear nights to spare, maybe you want to pass on it on a night of really bad seeing, find something that doesn't have quite the same resolution and brightness that some of the that the Veil targets have, because you want to take advantage of all the crisp details in the Veil nebulas. So again, you can kind of go ahead and make your own decisions on what you're going to shoot, but really understand what you're going to get out of those targets, and make sure that you know what you expect out of them, because then you can actually examine your data and make sure that you know if your data is producing what you want. So now I'm going to move on to actually capturing RGB stars. My personal opinion is that a lot of times narrowband stars can be pretty big distraction to narrowband images, and I personally prefer to see either white stars or RGB stars in narrowband images, and there's a couple of ways you can deal with it. One is you can completely desaturate your RGB or your narrowband stars whenever you do your processing and turn them all to white. And to me, that's kind of a little better option than the purple or kind of faint blue stars that you'll often see, because then you're looking at your target and you're not looking at the stars that are, I think it's more a psychological thing, your stars that are some weird color that you're not used to seeing. So you might spend a lot of time kind of looking at them and thinking about them instead of the actual target. But usually I actually prefer to replace RGB stars into my image and have those take the place of the white stars. At the end, I can do a little bit of demonstration if we have time, or if there's any questions on how to actually replace your stars with RGB stars. But the nice thing about taking these is that you're not actually really trying to process your photo for final presentation when you're processing your RGB stars. You're actually just trying to make sure that you're getting a lot of color into them and getting a lot of saturation, and that you're making sure that you're getting color in all the stars, including the really small stars. So a lot of times when I'm processing my stars only channel for these targets, I will go in and do a lot of curves, and I'll find the faintest stars I can and try and even stretch those above the sky, and a lot of times that'll actually give me some pretty noisy images, but to be honest, I usually don't care because of the way that I actually put the RGB stars back into the image. I'm not putting the sky into there, so I don't really care if there's a lot of noise in the sky. Sometimes I am putting the sky in there too, which will be another discussion altogether. But if I'm only putting the stars in, usually I will shoot about 90 minutes, anywhere from an hour to 90 minutes worth of 3-minute subs. And that's when I'm shooting RGB subs, taking them with red, green, and blue filters. If I'm doing one-shot colors, I might do a little bit less. The reason for the 90 minutes is because I like to get at least 10 subs per channel so that my stacking methods work well, and I found that 3 minutes is a long enough exposure to get even most of the faintest stars that I care about into the image. If I'm doing one-shot color, I might go down to like 15 3-minute subs and use 45 minutes worth of one-shot color subs to get the stars in there. But obviously the more that you take, the sharper your stars are going to be, the more color you should be able to get into there. Just a couple things to remember if you're going to take the time to really care about putting RGB stars back into your image. A couple fundamental thoughts of taking your blue data while it's highest in the sky so that it doesn't get really bloated. I think that's kind of just an important thing to remember to do. Adam, at this point, are there any questions?
I haven't seen any questions yet.
Okay, I'll keep going. So here's an example of kind of an artistic way that you can present RGB stars with just monochrome data. This is a HA-only version of the Eastern Veil Nebula, and I'm using my RGB stars that I captured to place over top of the Eastern Veil Nebula. So if I go back and forth between the two slides, you can see just the stars only here, and then being able to lay them on top of the nebula there. So going forward, I will go into some of the kind of meat of actually processing narrowband data and getting it ready to present, or getting it ready to combine with other narrowband data to make a color image. So the big thing that a lot of us work on is tone mapping. Um, and there's quite a few people who've done a lot of tutorials on tone mapping, kind of a handful of different approaches, but usually just sort of different approaches, with kind of the main idea being that you're going to remove your stars from monochrome data during processing to allow you to stretch it further and get more out of the image. JP Mesvino has a website, Astrodon and RGB, where he's put up quite a few tutorials on tone mapping. And I believe he now has some actions for Photoshop that actually removes the stars for you. Will create separate star layers or remove the stars for you if you don't want to go through and do that yourself. But I've found it to just be absolutely invaluable in processing my narrowband data. What it usually let you do is stretch the data a lot further. You don't have to worry as much about big star halos. Give you a lot greater contrast possible and kind of a different view of the region. Once you actually get rid of the stars, you can start using inverted screen masks. You can use screen layers, and you can use slight blurs on it, and you can really, really stretch pretty far to get a lot of the fainter dust revealed that you normally wouldn't be able to do if you're too worried about the stars. So at the end of this presentation, I'll probably spend most of the time kind of talking about tone mapping processing. But you know, the thing with tone mapping is I think that there's two kind of fundamental approaches. One is to keep the stars really in check and mostly removed if you are planning on putting stars back into the image. And then there's another way that you would present your image as a final starless image, in which case I think you have kind of a different bear altogether with how you're processing it. If you're doing a final starless image, it's kind of a much more iterative technique where you're constantly keeping your eyes on the stars and, you know, using steps to mute them as you're stretching and getting more contrast. But if you keep processing and you don't keep a close eye on your stars as you're going through your processing, remnants of them will come back. Sometimes you call them ghosts, or sometimes, you know, just the halo will start reappearing. And if you're going to replace them with RGB stars or just replace them with your tone map monochrome stars, then you don't have to keep quite as close an eye on them. So an example of kind of a starless final presentation with tone mapping was the Horsehead Nebula that I took a while back. And as you can see in this image, kind of the way that I go about tone mapping is that I'll do some slight stretching from the upper left to the bottom left image. You know, I get it to the point where I can see the data that I'm working with. I can see the image, you know, the target data, which is the horsehead and the flame in this one. And I also let most of the faint stars start showing their face, basically. I want most of them to be appearing in the data so that I can actually work on removing them. If you try to remove them too early, then a lot of the faint stars will start showing up, you know, every time you stretch it, and I think that makes tone mapping a lot more challenging. But also, if you go too far and go to the end of the image, like in the bottom right before you remove your stars, then you have a lot of really big bright stars, and those are nearly impossible to get rid of at that point without really heavily damaging your data. So in a final starless presentation image like this, you know, you get from the first step to the second step in the bottom left. In the top right, you can see that the stars are gone. And then in the bottom right, you can see the final presentation. But there's quite a few steps in between there where you're actually removing the stars almost between every action that you take in Photoshop. So that's what I'll probably spend a little bit of time after the presentation going over. So on to talking about color mapping. Color mapping is a way to combine your narrowband channels to create a color image. So a lot of times people will do this in Photoshop, PixInsight, I believe they have Pixel Math. I think CCD Stack will actually create color images for you, as well as a few others. Typically I do all of my color mapping in Photoshop. And to do the color mapping, I will process each one of my narrowband channels nearly to the end. I get them, to the point where I'm almost happy with them as being images I would share before I combine the channels. If I'm planning on putting RGB stars back in there, I will combine the 3 channels as starless images. So that way I'm basically just putting 3 color channels together that don't have stars into them. And the reason that I do it that way is that you can really stretch them quite a bit further than you normally would, and put a little blur on them and use them for your color data, and then you can actually combine the highlights of those 3 channels to make a luminance channel. But when you actually go to combine your channels, there's quite a few ways to do that. And I think the most popular and most prevalent way to do that is the Hubble palette, which is the SHO presentation. SHO refers to kind of the data that you're replacing RGB with. So when you're processing an image in Photoshop or wherever you're processing it, PixInsight, usually you're doing RGB images, and you're using red, green, and blue. So when you're using narrowband channels, you have to map those to the 3 colors, which are red, green, and blue. So you will put, for the Hubble palette, the S2 into the red channel. To the green channel, you would put H, hydrogen alpha, and then to the blue channel, you would put oxygen. And so that's what most of the Hubble images are used that way. And a lot of the amateur astronomers like to present images that way as well. That actually usually is not my favorite channel, depending on the target. And again, this is something where you can say know your target and know what kind of data is in there. So targets that are really heavy in hydrogen alpha and have very weak oxygen or S2 signal are going to typically be very green if you present it in the Hubble palette. Some examples like that would be, like the Cygnus region or North American Nebula or the Pelican Nebula. They tend to be pretty green. And if you're not a big fan of the green channels or the green images, and you want something that's kind of more red or purple or somewhere in the kind of pink-orange colors, then usually I like to go with HSO, which is putting hydrogen back into the red channel, putting S2 into the green channel, and then oxygen into the blue channel. Really, it's kind of just a personal preference thing, and you can play around with it a lot. I will spend a little bit of time in Photoshop after this presentation showing you how you can actually change those colors as well. But there's really a lot of pretty well-known ways to do that. And I will also follow up with another tutorial on the Astro Imaging channel going over color mapping to follow up with the tone mapping tutorial. Another way to actually combine narrowband channels into a color image that is pretty common is bicolor images, and these usually are the ones that I really enjoy for a number of reasons, and maybe one of the main ones being that it takes less time to take them. And also, I just really like the colors that can be presented with bicolor images. A lot of times the targets that are really good for bicolor images are planetary nebulas because they're just really strong in hydrogen alpha and really strong in oxygen. Other targets that are like that, the Veil nebulas, while they have actually 3 really strong channels, you can also get some really pretty red and blue images out of the Veil by using hydrogen and oxygen. One of the other benefits of bicolor images like this are that you can get kind of a little more natural looking final presentation. It's pretty challenging to get something that looks like what would be a RGB image when you're using all 3 of the narrowband channels. But if you're using hydrogen alpha and oxygen, you can do some blending tricks to get them to look pretty natural. The way that I usually do that, if I'm just doing bicolor only, would be putting red in the HA in the red channel. Then I would do some sort of mix in the green. Usually I'll start off with a 50-50 mix of O3 for the green channel. 50-50 mix of O3 and hydrogen alpha in the green channel, and then only put oxygen in the blue channel. And depending on how strong it is, I might mix a little bit of hydrogen alpha into the blue channel as well. I might do like a 50-50 for the green, and then maybe like a 20-80 for the blue channel. And you can play with a lot of that, and that's kind of really part of the beautiful part of narrowband image processing, is that it goes away from being as objective maybe as RGB, where there's definite colors that you should be seeing if you're really getting them accurate, to really kind of just a subjective adventure. And it's all about what makes you happy. Sometimes it's about what makes other people happy, but there's you're not actually taking, except for oxygen is, but the hydrogen alpha and S2 are not, so you can kind of do whatever you want with them. So here's a bicolor example where I took a lot of hydrogen alpha data, which is down on the bottom left. I took a lot of oxygen data, which is in the upper left. And then I took probably, I think at this one was maybe 2 hours worth of RGB data, mostly for the stars, and part of it was because I was just messing around with my camera. And I wanted to combine these into a bicolor image. And this one was an interesting example because it was very strong in hydrogen alpha. And if I just presented it as a regular bicolor image, it would have been cherry red. As soon as I put the hydrogen into the red channel and the oxygen into I actually think I started by putting oxygen into the blue and green channels. There was just, the oxygen data was so faint compared to the hydrogen alpha that it looked very, very red. So I did some pretty strong combinations in this one, where I actually put a lot of hydrogen alpha into the green and blue channel as well, to kind of get this interesting new color mix. And as you can see, there's kind of a lot of yellowish highlights where the hydrogen alpha is the brightest in the bottom left. And that's because there was sort of a lot in the green and blue channels for this one. So another way to go through and actually combine your data, besides just bicolor or Hubble palette or HSO, is to combine RGB data from either one-shot color or from RGB filters and put that together with your narrowband data. So you can do this by only replacing the stars, as I mentioned earlier. You can replace the background sky and the stars with your RGB data, which sometimes I find to be pretty beneficial. Sometimes I get some weird blotchiness with my narrowband backgrounds, or sometimes I get gradients that are kind of tough, especially when I'm doing hour-long subs in O3. The gradients are challenging to deal with, so I might want to replace the background sky with my RGB sky, which is a little easier to balance and remove gradients from. You can actually add all of them together. You can just add the narrowband channels to your RG and B channels. You can create luminance channels with your hydrogen alpha, or you can combine them with synthetic luminance channels. So it really just opens up a lot of possibilities of how you actually can put together your data. Usually, when you're putting your data together, you have to blend them, different opacities, and kind of, again, a subjective thing. But if you're not careful with your hydrogen alpha when you're putting it in there as a luminance or combining it with your red channel, then you're going to end up having sort of a pinkish or salmonish looking red channel, which I think a lot of people call the dreaded salmon color, and that's usually not something that's a very pleasing photo. So you have to learn how to kind of blend those, and there's a lot of ways to do that, including going into lab mode and pasting your hydrogen alpha into the light channel, lightness channel, or maybe blending a little bit of it into your luminosity. But there's a lot of ways to do that. So talking about actually combining data, here's an example of combining one-shot color with narrowband and actually adding them together. So I collected a good bit of one-shot color data for the Dumbbell Nebula last year, and as I was talking about earlier, I really wanted to get a lot of the outer blue ears on this target, or bluish greenish ears that are come from the oxygen. And I would have never been able to get that by exposing really long with my one-shot color camera, because the stars would have become all bloated and the rest of the sky would have been bloated, and it just I wouldn't have been able to do that. So I mean, this took quite long exposures in oxygen. And then, as you can see, I was mentioning I really wanted the details from the hydrogen alpha in the bottom left. And so I actually added the O3 to both the green and blue channel, and I added the HA to the red channel. But I used a mask to make sure I was only adding the data from the nebula itself and not to the stars, because I wanted to retain the somewhat natural-looking star colors of the image. And this was a cool way to come up with what looked like a pretty natural-looking final image, but taking full advantage of all of the narrowband data that I was able to gather. So another way that you can do this, instead of just adding the narrowband data to your RG and B channels, is to use your hydrogen alpha as kind of an enhancer. And in this target, the Bubble Nebula, there's not a ton of oxygen, there's not a ton of S2, but there's a lot of hydrogen alpha in that region. And again, this is an image that I took with the one-shot color camera last year, and was able to get what I thought was a pretty image at the time, and it is a pretty good image. And I think these were 10-minute subs of one-shot color. The one thing that the 10-minute subs allowed me to do was make sure that I still had plenty of star color. So I was really happy that I showed the cluster down there, M52 I believe it is, and retain a lot of star color in there. But I wasn't very happy with how much nebulosity was coming through on the image. So this year, when I went back to test the region out, I decided I wanted to bring out a lot of the red nebulosity. So to do that, I took a lot of pretty long exposures. I think these were 30-minute subs that I took of hydrogen alpha. And I took maybe 5 or 6 hours worth of them. And this image I ended up using a kind of cool technique to get the colors that I did. I processed it one time when I first got it, and I did a straight HA RGB image where I used the an HA RGB image where I used the HA as the luminance channel and then blended it into the red channel. And it came out. It wasn't quite as colorful as I hoped, and I think I got a little bit of that salmon color that I mentioned before that I wasn't really happy with. So this time I actually used the HA data pretty liberally to get what I wanted for the final image. So I made an extracted luminance channel from the RGB data, and I blended the HA into that. Then I blended the HA into the R channel, and it doesn't say it on there, but I actually took a little bit of the HA data and put it into the blue and green channel. And the reason I did this was that I wanted to stretch the RGB data quite a bit to get a lot more of the colors out of the stars, and especially the faint stars. When I processed this the first time, a lot of the faint stars just weren't really showing much color. So I wanted to be able to stretch them out a little more. So adding that tiny bit of hydrogen alpha gave just a little bit of an offset to the information for the small stars, but kept the same actual color information in all of them, since I gave the same offset to each channel. So this was, kind of an image that ended up just using hydrogen alpha across the board in every channel. Just to really enhance it and to let me stretch it further and get a lot brighter and kind of more vibrant colors out of it. So again, just a lot of different ways to use narrowband data to get the most out of your images. So finally, I will go into kind of the ways that your narrowband images can be presented. And I've shown, I think, examples of all of them now. But again, my favorite part about narrowband images is that there's not one way to do it. There's not really kind of restraints on how you are going to share your image. So I've explored all of these and think depending on which target you're on, you can do some pretty cool things. So you can do starless monochrome images, as I showed with my Horsehead Nebula and the Star Nebula, or the Flame Nebula, sorry. And that one was with no stars whatsoever. And there were a lot of really cool details that were revealed in that by not having stars kind of distract you from your final image. You can do a monochrome images where you're showing the, kind of sharp details in the hydrogen alpha data, for example, but also one image that I did this with, I think that showed a lot nicer, was Lot 15. I had a starless image as well, which looked interesting, but the image just never quite looked right without stars, so I kept the stars in there for that final presentation. You can do, like with the Bubble Nebula I just showed, some HA-LRGBs or HA blended into some of the different channels. You can do straight Hubble palette or some other combination color mapped. You can also do just a narrowband with one-shot color added together, like the Dumbbell Nebula. So it gives you a way just to really enhance every one of your channels with your different narrowband channels. Finally, you can do just a straight color mapped image, as I showed with the Eastern Veil Nebula, and just replace the stars from your narrowband data with RGB stars. And a lot of times I really like that kind of final outcome, especially when it's a more natural looking image like the Eastern Veil Nebula. And finally, you can do GIF, which I actually started doing recently with all my images. Shown here, where you're actually presenting each of the different channels. I think that this is really a beneficial thing to do, maybe not just for yourself, but for everyone in the astronomy community, because what it does is it shares how you actually were able to get the data for this image. A lot of times when you go on cloudy nights and people are talking about, hey, I'm shooting the Veil tonight, and I'm wondering what I should expect. If I shoot 20-minute exposures, is there much O3 in there? If I shoot 40-minute exposures, is there going to be a lot? Or what do I need to do to get what I'm looking for out of it? So I've started just including every channel of data that I collect, and then any kind of synthetic luminance that I processed out of the image, I also include that in there, and I think it's just a cool way to present how you built your image, and also kind of a cool way to share with the community what data you're actually presenting. So it's always helpful, and I think that I took my cue on this from Bill Snyder, who is actually from Pennsylvania as well, and he has just an awesome website. But every single image that he has, he presents not only his final RGB channels or whatever narrowband he's using, but he also shows what a single sub looks like stretched out, so you can know what to expect from a single sub. And I found that to be kind of my most valuable tool in planning to capture an image, and deciding how much data I need for each channel, and deciding what I actually am going to be able to get out of each channel. So that does it for the presentation. So I'm going to stop on the presentation here and ask Adam if there's any questions. See if there's any questions from anybody else, and if not, I can go into sharing a little bit of the tone mapping processing that I did.
There haven't been any questions in group chat or Q&A. If anyone in the room has any questions, feel free to ask.
So, okay, let me see if I can go over and share my Horsehead Nebula then. Make sure that I'm actually sharing this with you guys.
Yes, we see it.
Okay, and it's zooming in and out for you?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I will do some stepping through how I actually do the tone mapping then. It looks like we have probably 15 or 20 minutes left, and I think this is kind of helpful to show some of the steps that I think a lot of people get hung up on whenever you're processing the narrowband data for tone mapping. So I'm going to roll all the way back to the beginning of the image. And for anybody who's interested, there is a video on the Astro Imaging channel. It's a tutorial on how I actually went through processing this data. And it's actually this exact Photoshop document. So you can.
Did you just roll back through the levels? What did you do right now?
I rolled all the way back through every layer to the very beginning.
What's your layer screen look like? What's your layer window look like? So you've got like each of those pictures we saw was actually a different level?
Different layer, yeah. I see. I'm looking at the screen.
Okay.
Yeah, looking at the screen, and it looks like you can't actually see my layers tab. So I'm going to see if I can change.
I can't see your layers tab.
Okay, let me see if I can change.
Screen.
Yeah, let me see if this one shows up. Can you see it now?
Yes.
I see you.
I can.
Adam, turn your mute yourself. You're coming in. I'm seeing you.
So okay, you can see the layers tab now?
Yeah, now I see your layers.
Okay. So I'll scroll back up through them so everyone can see. So I was just turning them on and off so you can see how I actually go through each of these layers and what's happening. So when I do any processing, I typically like to try and stay as organized as possible. So from some of our Astro Imaging channel's tutorials, I've learned a lot about using folders to help keep myself organized. I think it was Scott Rosen who showed us some pretty cool things you could do with folders a while back. So as you see, if I collapse this folder, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 folders that I'm working in, and inside of these 9 folders, there's a handful of folders for each one of these as well, or at least a handful of different actions. So starting this processing off, as I mentioned, my first step is to do just some initial stretches on the data. And I actually label each one of these so that I know what's going on, and so I can go back and tweak them. Usually I'm not using full opacity on these either, so because they're layers that I'm adding by doing a copy merge and pasting them on top, I'm just grabbing the data where it was and pasting a new layer on top. So without a full opacity, I can go back and tweak stuff near the very beginning and have it affect the final image. So to start with, for the narrowband processing, I always just do a handful of initial stretches. And so my initial stretch will usually just be a couple of levels, stretches, and sometimes I'll put in a little curve. So usually I'll do couple levels till I can see where I want to crop, and then I'll crop the image down, and then I'll do another level stretch that'll get me to the point where I have the background where I like to work with it at. And usually I try and keep the background at about 40 when I'm going through processing my images. I typically like to share my images with the background pretty high too. I usually use them around, or share them around 30 or 35, but I always work with them around 40. So I do a handful of initial stretches in the crop and get it so the target's pretty bright, and so the background is where I want it. So then, if I come up into my first steps for star removal, you can see the first thing that I'll do is I'll come in and do some star reductions. And you can do this in a handful of ways with some masks and minimum filters, or you can use one of a number of actions available. I actually usually use Annie's Astro Actions and use her star. Let me make sure I'm getting the title of it right, since I'm going to say that's what I use. I use a little bit of reduced star bloating, 1 or 2 passes of that, and then quite a few of the reduced star sizes. I really like her action for that because I think that it does not have a huge impact on the actual target. If it does, usually I'll try and mask it off as much as possible. But you can see it doesn't actually not touch it at all. So if I zoom way in here and I go from this layer to this layer after the star shrinking, then it affects the horse head some. And then if I put the darken layer on there, then it gets a little detail back in there. It's probably pretty hard to see on the screen, but it works and it helps a lot. So I will, after I reduce the stars, I will put on another layer and use it as a darken layer to bring back in the dark details and the dust. So moving up through the processing, I do some dust and scratches filters and despeckle filters to get rid of kind of the majority of the rest of the stars. So the first thing that I'll do is a dust and scratch. And a lot of times I'll run this with radius of around 2, 3, 4 pixels. I try and do it in a way that doesn't affect the nebula too much, but there's not a lot of getting around what it actually does to the nebula. So if I click this on and off, you can see a lot of that detail really disappears, but at the same time the stars disappear as well. And then I will run, I think what I did was I ran the dust and scratch, or sorry, the despeckle filter at the same time on this layer. And
Josh,
as you can see it. Yes.
you notice you've got an eyeball showing on pre-processing? You're right there.
Yeah.
You need that in there to show us. I guess you have to get that in there to show us what's happening. Okay.
Right. All the, yeah. This is all
not
kind of folders within this folder. Yeah. So all of these things that I'm working on in here, these folders that I'm showing you, are subfolders within the pre-processing folder. So if I don't have that clicked on, then it'll go all the way back down to the beginning. So if I click that up, you can see everything I've shown you so far is within that initial folder. So then where I was at is that, so I'll do that dust and scratches and despeckle. I think that despeckle is actually very powerful, and I'm not sure if people use that a lot or not, but that does a really great job of getting rid of a lot of the really faint stars and the really small stars. And then once again, as I said, usually it's a really iterative process. I put in a darken layer, and I didn't do a good job of labeling these two layers. But as you can see, if I zoom way in on the horse head here, this darken layer really brings back a lot of that detail back into the horse head. And it does it throughout the image, but it becomes pretty apparent right in that area. If I zoom in on some of this other dust and drag my box out of the way, you can actually see it does a good job over there of actually bringing some of that detail back as well. So then, let's see where we're at here. Detail reveal, another subfolder. So I think that this one actually was where I come in and I paste back on 2 layers that were from before I removed these stars. And when I paste these back on, as you can see with this layer mask, I'm only revealing some very faint or very small and selective regions within the image. And as you can see here, I'm blocking out some of these stars, and that's because there's some data that I cared a lot about bringing back into this image, and specifically on the horse head. The darken layer brought back some of it, but I really wanted to get a lot of this really kind of fine and wispy stuff within the ears of the horse. So I took an image, or took a copy of the image from before I actually removed the stars and pasted that back on, and only used very select regions right in here. And then going on from there, we'll do the final star cleanup. And so usually this is what I would call the divergent point after this point. So I do a final star cleanup. You can see if I click off here, some faint stars got back into the image as I was going through the last few steps of processing. And so I will remove them at that point. And sometimes I think that what I probably did with these were just used the spot healing brush or spot healing tool. Sometimes there's just going to be a handful that you can't get rid of with the dust and scratches. You can't get rid of with despeckle, and the spot healing brush does a really great job of just removing those couple of run-in stars. I don't like to use it too much because really what it does is destroy the data. So as little as possible, I try to use that, but sometimes there's no getting rid of it. So again, I kind of called this all of my pre-processing, because I call this my divergent point, where if you look through all these folders and subfolders, there's a lot of work done to get to a starless image point. And from here forward, I can either process the data as if I was going to combine it with some other channels as a color mapped image, or if I'm going to present it as a final starless image, I'm continually paying pretty close attention to the stars as I go forward. So here's a point where I go through my levels and curves processing. I got to the starless image, and I won't spend a lot of time in here because this is kind of, you know, basic processing, or maybe not basic processing, but it's processing that's covered with a lot of other tutorials. But I'm going to do a curve stretch to kind of bring out some of the light regions that I care about, and the highlights up on top of the dust. And once I get some separation from from the bright regions from the darker regions that I really care about, then I can just do a big regular curve stretch. And as you see, with just, that was really, I think it was just 1 or 2 curves. Once I have the highlights separated with this stretch right here, then the big curve will move everything up off of the floor, and make it a lot easier to work with, and it kind of just spreads the histogram out. As you can see, doing this big stretch brought some stars back in, and this is what's going to happen if you continue to stretch. And again, if you're doing a final color mapped image where you're putting stars back in, you don't care. These stars are so tiny that you're going to cover them up, or they'll be blended into the color data, but they just won't appear in the final image. But if you're doing a final starless image, you need to take care of them. And so again, kind of a combination of a small dust and scratches filter, this time probably with a radius of 2, and a despeckle, get rid of those stars again. You can see they go away pretty nicely. And then as usual, every time I run a dust and scratches or despeckle filter, I'll do a darken layer. And it's not a huge difference, but it is noticeable. I mean, in the details, you can see that it actually helps a good bit again. And then I get into doing some selective curves to bring out some of the highlights a little further that I really care about. And let's see, going forward, I can read this as I go. Okay, so here's where I go into my high pass filters actions. So I guess they're not actions, but I have a set of high pass filters that I run on every single image I process. And really, I have a pretty standard way that I do these, and they're just the opacity is usually the difference in what I do with these for every image. But I do a large scale, medium scale, and a small scale high pass filter. One layer is an overlay, and one layer is a soft light. And I'll combine those into a folder, and usually I'll change the opacity on that folder as well. So if I come all the way down here to the beginning of this set, then you can see the first thing I do is my high pass, or my large scale high pass. And so I'll do a high pass overlay layer and a high pass soft light layer. And I think that's having a little bit of a hard time showing up. Yes, okay, and then I'll do a medium one. And you can see that I try to make these subtle. I'm not trying to make the data extremely sharp or anything like that. Anytime I'm doing anything that's like a sharpening action, like high-pass filters, I try to do them as subtle as I can. So if I go into these, you can see the opacity on the large-scale layers is 50%, and then I put that into a folder that's 57%, and then that folder goes into a combined folder with the other size scale folders that's at a 50% opacity. So if you take 50 of 50 of 50, you're down in kind of the 12.5% range of what your final opacity is from these large scale opacities. So if I come up here to this large scale opacity, or the final folder, and move this opacity up and down, you can see it kind of changing how, I don't know if I'm doing that too fast, but you can see how sharp this makes it and kind of how contrasty. If I turn it all the way down, you can see it goes away and becomes pretty fuzzy. So usually I like to process my data in a way that I'm sitting around 50% opacity. So as far as numbers go for each of these scales, the large scale I usually run at about 50 pixels. If I zoom out here, usually that just helps kind of reveal the large structures, some of these bigger puffs of gas behind the horse head. And then the medium structures come in, and yeah, you get an intuitive feel for it, but they'll come in and they'll actually help kind of these mounds in this region here. And then the small scale structures will be sort of like these faint wisps in here. And so the medium size scale high pad out 15 pixels, a radius of 15 pixels, and the small scale I usually run at 2 to 3 pixels. So again, it's 50, 15, and 2 or 3 are usually what I run. So that's my set of high pass filters that I will always run on every image, and I just kind of control how much they affect the image by the opacity of each of the subfolders, and then I take a look at what the whole folder is doing and change that opacity. So moving on, I go into star control, and as I mentioned, you know, really if you're trying to present this as a final image, you're going to run into star issues again, and you know, stars aren't really prominent here, and you don't see them everywhere, but you can start seeing kind of little remnants showing up here and there, and you know, I don't know. Just if I'm going to present a final image, I care about even all these little details, and like these little stars showing up in here. If I zoom way in, you can see it. So again, every time that I do anything in a starless image, I come back in and do star control. And so I do a handful of darkened layers. I think these ones, yeah, these were just mixed in. Looks like I actually just did 2 darkened layers at the same time. That could have just been a mistake. And then, so another thing sometimes I'll run into is that I really struggle to get rid of some maybe faint stars in the image. You can see some of these remnants. I don't know how well they show up or not. Let me see if I can zoom way in on those. You can see them kind of up in here. There's ghosting, maybe you want to call it, or remnants, and I care a lot about those being in there too. So I'll actually run another set, like kind of a small blur, and then I think a little bit of noise reduction combined with another dust and scratches filter, and you can see it actually does a pretty good job there, even getting rid of some of these little blobs there. So I think if you really want to do a starless image presentation, I think it's worth it to go through and really spend maybe the extra 2 hours in processing it to get rid of every star in the image and make sure they stay under control. We're at 10:30, but I think I'll keep going and probably have another 10 minutes left to get through the rest of this image, and share kind of what I've done. Another thing I like to do is, I guess with every image I run a handful of actions that I really like, that I'll usually run on every image, and again control them based on opacity. So one of my very favorite actions there is in Photoshop is Annie's Astro Actions Enhanced Dust Lanes. I think that it just works great. It works great on galaxies, on nebula, and just everything. And again, I'm just kind of controlling the opacity here, but if I bump that opacity way up, let's see, where are we at? On this one, bump that opacity way up, then you can see a big difference there, how it really just brings a lot of crispness to the details. And then I guess I put those all into a folder with this one. And then also her dynamic enhance folder, or action, sorry. Those 2 actions I think are just really wonderful. I hardly ever use either of them at full opacity. In fact, I use them both pretty subtly. The enhanced dust lanes, it looks like I'm using at 57%, and the dynamic enhance at 30%, yeah, 28%. Usually that's a pretty safe number for how I like to use that, and that just kind of brings a little more contrast. At full bore, I think it just brings too much brightness into the highlights and starts blowing out those structures, and it makes the dark regions a little too dark. So that filter, or that action, I'll usually run around the 30% mark. So when I start getting sort of towards the end of the image, and I'm getting pretty happy with where I'm at, I kind of do I guess an assessment of what the noise is looking like. And this data was taken under some pretty dark skies, and I think it took some long subs for it, so it's pretty clean, but it's still not great. You know, especially if you go into the darker regions. If you're in the brighter regions, a lot of signal, it doesn't look too bad, but you kind of come into these darker regions and it gets very speckly. And you know, I encourage people to pixel peep on my images, and I like them to pixel peep, so I try and pay attention to every pixel, I guess. So yeah, I'll usually run handful of noise reduction things towards the end, and I'll oftentimes actually mask off the bright parts of the image. And if you can see, this is an inverted mask where really the brightest parts where the signal is strong is completely masked off, because I don't think there's much noise at all there. I might touch it up a little bit, which I did in the next step with a low opacity noise filter, but I don't want to touch it all with the stronger one. The stronger one I save for the darker regions. So these darker regions down in here that I was zoomed way in on, I'll go back over to that. I care a lot about getting with the noise reduction filter. It's probably a combination of a deep, I can't remember what it's called. It's part of the astronomy tools actions. I'll use a combination of a deep space noise reduction and Annie's Make Image Smoother and Noise Ninja, and then I'll run all three of those together, but I'll mask off almost the entire image, and then the entire folder gets a very low opacity, so I'm using it kind of pretty subtly, but you can see that it has a dramatic improvement kind of on these speckles that I really care about. They're not all completely gone, but it makes a big difference. And then once I run that, I'll still do kind of a pretty subtle Noise Ninja sweep across the entire image. And as you can see, I'm just running this at an opacity of 22%, and it shouldn't show a big difference, because as I said, there's not a lot of noise there, but it is cleaning up. I mean, if I zoom way in, you can see it kind of cleans up the noise a little bit, but pretty subtly. So usually I'll use those noise reduction filters to get my image to a point where it's near the end, and I kind of do it in a funky order, where I'll run some noise reduction to allow me to do a final sharpen and contrast boost. So I use the ancient CS2, which doesn't have any kind of deconvolution or anything like that, but it does have smart sharpen, which is generally super overkill on the background sky and stars and stuff like that, but I will run it sometimes just to get a little more detail in the nebula. And as you can see, it's really subtle. I try and keep most of these actions near the end very subtle. So my processing in general starts off as pretty big swoops and big actions, and the closer I get to the end, the more subtle my moves become, and the more subtle the improvements become, and just kind of inching my way towards my final image. So you can see I'll do sharpen to get just a little more detail on the horse head, and then I'll do a little contrast boost, and again, that's only run at 50% opacity, and a little contrast boost just brings out the highlights just ever so slightly. And then I actually even put all of those moves into a folder that's run at 50% opacity and also masked at the same time. And sometimes I get a little lost, and I have masks of certain regions kind of contradicting masks of subfolders. So I usually try to be pretty careful about going back in and actually making sure that that's not happening too much. And sometimes I forget, because I get a little heavy on all of these. So finally, again, like I said, every time I run a set of actions, I'll come in and do another set of star cleanup. If you look before this, some stars were starting to show back up in here again, and I want to kind of reduce those again. And again, these are just tiny stars that you probably wouldn't notice unless you really went looking very deep into the picture, but they're there. So by the time they're this small, I think usually a couple of despeckle filters will get rid of the small stars on its own pretty well. And as you can see, it does do a pretty good job of just reducing those. And again, as always, I run a darken filter if I'm going to be doing any kind of dust and scratches or despeckle, just to bring back in the details. And then I think looks like I had labeled this dark region star cleanup, which means that there was probably some remaining stars down in the dark region. And as you can see, you can look at my mask, you can tell where it was. It must have been up in this kind of upper corner. And yep, you can see kind of some faint stars right in here, even down in here were showing up. So I went in and masked off the rest of the image, and it looks like what I did was probably a slight blur, like a Gaussian pixels or something, just to get rid of those final, remaining stars that were just kind of being a little bit tricky to get rid of. And again, this is up in a region where there's not really a lot of sharp detail anyway, so I think it's okay to put a little Gaussian blur on those. And then looks like I did a final brighten just to bring out some more of the data, and probably was just setting my dark point where I wanted it for the final image presentation. So that is a full kind of walkthrough of how I go through and do a starless image processing. So I am going to call the presentation at that, see if there's any questions, and open it up to group chat from there.
Well, I'm just reading John Rista's comment, and I'm pretty sure that you've answered it by now. He says, I guess my question really boils down to star removal. How exactly do you do that? And I think I don't know when he asked this question, but I'm guessing it was before you started with this presentation, because I think that was pretty thorough.
Okay. Good. Well, hopefully it does. And as I mentioned before, there's actually 2 star removal tutorials on the Astro Imaging channel. One on the Pelican Nebula, which was kind of a little more straightforward, and I think the data was a little easier to work with in removing the stars. And then the Horsehead Nebula tutorial was a lot more thorough. It was kind of like this, but actually showed me doing each one of these moves in each of the folders, so you can see, step by step how I'm doing it and actually watch it happen live.
I just have one quick question as I wipe my nose with my cold. Putting stars back in, obviously you're in a monochrome image here, so you wouldn't do it with this, but with a color image, do you just use lighten mode, or is it more complex than that?
So it depends if I'm using color stars or just monochrome, as you said. But yeah, I mean, if I'm just if I'm just putting stars back into the image in a monochrome image, I mean, I could come all the way down. I can do this real quick, just for the fun of it. The tricky part, and I do usually use lighten mode, but the tricky part will be where is your image at, compared to where are your stars at compared to your image. And if you've got a lot of really bright nebulosity, then sometimes the stars aren't actually brighter than nebulosity and they won't show back up. But so I just went back down to the last place that I had stars in there, and then if I come back up and paste it over top at the very end, and I do that in a lighten mode. Where's my lighten? Right there. You can see it brings it back in. So problem is that you'll get really sharp stars out of nowhere when you do that. So usually it is a little more tricky, but I guess I would have stretched this data a little more before I would paste them back in. The one that I pasted on top, because you want it to be kind of far along. The one with the stars that you're actually putting in there. That way your fainter stars are showing up as pretty bright, but then also they're not quite as like sharp, crisp points, which I don't think looks very good. It looks kind of just like a disk in space right there, like that. When you actually stretch your data some, they turn into three-dimensional objects. So I will use a lighten mode, but it would be what, you know, I might even just do a dozen small levels and curve stretches on the initial data to get it to, you know, a point that would be maybe be a quarter of the way through processing before lightening it. And then replacing RGB stars is, I think, a different story altogether, and maybe worth a tutorial on its own with color mapping.
All right. John Rissa says thank you. It's been answered. He asked it just when we asked for questions. So.
Okay, great.
All right. Anyone else in the room have any questions? Related or unrelated to the topic?
It looks like no questions.
You must have answered it very thoroughly, or presented it very thoroughly.
I hope so. We're always here for more questions. Maybe we'll wrap it up and then have a discussion about future presentations.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks to all of the viewers on YouTube. You know where to find us, whether it's on this channel or on Cloudy Nights. I'm going to wrap up the live broadcast, so you guys will probably get cut off, and we'll discuss amongst ourselves. Thanks for coming.